Good evening all, and welcome. The deep woods are certainly mysterious, hiding plenty of secrets, many of which we are going to uncover now, with these 10 terrifying stories. So get ready and get comfortable to let the darkness take control. My cousin is with the Forest Service in the Montana/Wyoming area, and I decided to go up there with her to literally test the waters. She does hydrology and has to ride out to the middle of nowhere to test streams and snow runoff to ensure no contaminants. So I thought that sounded fun and wanted to do a bit of a tour with her. We were going to have to camp out there for 2 nights, so we packed all our gear in saddlebags and started out. The first night and day were amazing. Beautiful scenery, amazing air quality, and it really was so peaceful out there. I love that area, and I wish I got to go up there more often. Anyway, we started out on the second day, and my cousin said to me, "Do you want to see something weird?" I said, "Of course," and she led me, a bit on the side, into this tiny little ravine. We ended up traveling about 2 hours away from our actual path we had laid out. At the very end of this fold in the land, she dismounts and tells me to get off my horse. We tie them up in this gorgeous little clearing, and she tells me to follow this tiny wildlife path and bring our little rechargeable radio. It's one of those that you can plug in or wind up, and also acts like a lantern if you really need it to, but that kills the batteries very quickly. I do, and out in the middle of nowhere, there is a huge coil of wire sticking out of the ground. The wire itself was not weirdly large, like someone buried a transmission wire, but small, 10 or 12 gauge wiring for a house. It trailed off into the brush and trees, so naturally I decided to follow the damn thing out of curiosity. My cousin trails behind me as I do, and this wire, after coming straight up from the ground, is strung across limbs of trees then back into the ground. Then it snakes around rocks and finally deadens into an outlet. That outlet is mounted to the side of a desk. It looks like a schoolteacher's desk from when I was growing up, with a metal base and pseudo wood/plastic top thing. No chair, no building, no nothing. Just this outlet, and this desk. I'm starting to get confused at hell at this point. Why is there a desk in the middle of a forest? When my cousin takes the radio and pulls out the cord and plugs it into the outlet, it lit up and started blaring static. The wire was being fed from somewhere. Now, the place where we were at had no road access, no buildings for many miles, and certainly no other people around. And yet, there was a live outlet. Weird as hell. No spooky jump scares or bodies, just one lone powered desk in the middle of the woods. I wish I'd have taken a picture of it. I often go up to Alaska to visit my grandparents and go fly fishing. It has to be my favorite hobby besides music. This one summer when I was about 14, I had an interesting experience. Me and my grandfather are hiking down this trail to our favorite fishing spot. It's about an 8-hour walk. We carry in tents, food, and fishing gear. When we get about halfway through the walk, we find that in the middle of the trail is what looks like a giant A. 2 trees were broken at the stump on either side of the trail and leaned against one another at the tips. These were these medium-sized bushy pine trees you see all over mountainsides, so we think nothing of it and pass under it and keep walking until we finally get to our campsite. When we get there, we find more broken trees like the one before, not just haphazardly, but literally in the same way. Both me and my grandfather are as confused as hell about this, but whatever, it's probably just some dumbass that found this place and wanted to scare people. Oh well. People were here messing around, so let's get set up. So we do, and settle in for the night. I'm in my single-person tent, and my grandfather is in his a few feet away. I fall asleep pretty quick. Sometime later that night, my grandfather starts shaking me by the shoulder and telling me to wake up. I crawl out of the tent to look around. It was that time of year. That night is just perpetual twilight, so we could still see pretty well. And all of a sudden I hear this high-pitched scream. Like if you've ever heard a lynx scream, it would have been pretty much dead on that, but it had some weird twinge to it. We both wrote it off as such, but I still thought something was off about it, and we sat there listening. The next morning we got up and started fishing. It was going great. Both me and my grandfather had caught a lot of grayling. We had moved down to where our backs were to the berm that was covered in brush. At the top were these good-sized rocks. After about 30 minutes, we hear this loud racket coming from camp, like someone was throwing our things around, and that same lynx scream was coming from the direction of our camp. And as soon as that one scream went up, a second one started from behind the berm. We both flip around and start looking at the berm while glancing back to camp, and we start seeing something move, just over the other side. This weird-looking head kept popping up and down. It was dark grey, shaped like Patrick's star, and we only saw what we thought was the forehead and up. Before we could make it out, this boulder, bigger than me at the time, comes flying over and lands right in front of me and my grandfather. Well, of course, we bolt back up to camp. When we get there, we find that all our gear is trashed. The tent had shreds in it, our coolers were thrown everywhere, and our packs torn open. We heard the damn scream again and started running. We ran and ran and ran until I puked. All the way we would hear whoops and the screams from far behind us. When we made it back to the A-shaped thing, the trees were snapped in half and thrown to the side. We finally made it back to my grandfather's truck and drove the hell out of there. We're never going back there again. I don't want to know what it was, and frankly I don't care. I'm just glad I got out of there. When I said I didn't want to go back there, enough time passed, I had spoken about it, and after telling my fiancée, I decided to brave it and return. When I showed her where the boulder landed, it was still there. But age puts perspective on things. It was about the size of an adult chest. So of course it was massive to 12-year-old me. I also found my old pocket knife around the area of the camp, but no other remains of the camp were present. And luckily, no stick structures either. This is my father's story. My father used to have a business in maintaining the woods. It's a thing in my country, which basically means cutting down dead trees and hauling them out of the area. This meant that he was out in the woods all day, and he was allowed in places normal citizens couldn't go because of rules by the Forestry Commission. My dad was working in the early morning when he suddenly noticed a car in the middle of the woods. It drove through a small path normally only used by the forester. It wasn't a car from the commission, so he thought it was very weird that it was there. However, Dad was alone, and it was the 80s, and he didn't have a mobile phone to contact anyone. Since it was in the middle of nowhere, he decided to ignore it. He kept on hauling wood through the woods with his horse, when he suddenly heard men speaking. Now my dad is a brave man and as strong as a bear, so he decided to take a quick peek to see what the hell those folks were doing. My dad looked around some thick bushes to make sure he could see the men. They were digging a hole. My father decided that it was something he really didn't want to interrupt, and he kept working through the day like nothing ever happened. He made sure to keep some distance between him and the digging site. The men apparently never noticed my dad, possibly because his equipment wasn't located in the direction the men came from, and my father worked with horses, so there weren't any loud machines. It was the 80s after all. At the end of the day, my father got to the local commission office and reported it, and they called the police. They went to the spot where the men had been burying something, and they found the body of a young woman. It still irks my dad to this day. He was alone out there. What if the men saw him? What if he decided to check the burial ground out himself? Scary possibilities. The following story stands out as the most unnerving thing I've ever experienced. It's one thing to see a sign warning about a predator in an area. It's another thing to be stalked by it all day. I went out one afternoon on my small john boat to do some fishing in the swamp, mainly for warmouth. I was pretty familiar with the area and motored out 3 to 4 miles to reach my favorite spot. Alligators are fairly commonplace out there, and it's just something you become accustomed to. Generally, if you respect them, they'll respect you, as they've become pretty used to fishermen. The water in the swamp are full of tannic acid from the decaying leaves at the bottom, so the water looks inky black at first, and visibility is only a few inches. Anything that is visible just under the surface is tinted a dark amber color. I had caught a few fish, and noticed that around 50 to 60 yards back up the canal, a pair of eyes floating just above the water were pointing in my direction. It was a gator. No big deal. They've learned to be opportunistic and steal stringers of fish if you leave them hanging over the side of the boat. I continued fishing for a few minutes. I had just reached down over the side of the boat to grab the lip of a warmouth I'd hooked. As I pulled the fish out, I saw the faintest glint of amber in the water about a foot below where my hand had just been. I watched as the faint glint slowly rose up towards the surface of the water, revealing 2 black eyes and the largest jaw on any gator I've seen in the wild. I slid back to the center of my small john boat. As the head of the gator broke the surface, I could feel it sliding back along the bottom of my boat, shifting it slightly. And after watching it for 10 to 15 seconds, it finally swam out from under the boat. I'm guessing it was pushing 12 to 13 feet, and that's after having seen hundreds of gators. This gator followed me for the rest of the day. I'd motor ahead a ways just to put some distance between us, and not long after I'd stop, I'd feel the familiar bump on the bottom of the boat each time. It would eventually swim off and then turn back and stare at me. I've never felt more outmatched. This dark, quiet, toothy thing had the ability to sneak up on you at any time it pleased and get within 3 feet of you before you even knew it was there. Do you know how unnerving it is to look something in the eye that makes it abundantly clear that it's only waiting for you to make a mistake? There's a level of intelligence and focus in those eyes that makes you understand your place in the food chain. It's not the first time gators have followed me. I've been followed by 3 at once before, but none have ever made me so intimately aware that the only thing on its mind was to drag me out my boat and under the surface of that black water. A few months ago, my friend and I went to hike Pikes Peak near Colorado Springs. The hike up this mountain is literally marathon, with about 7,000 feet of vertical gain, and the general rule of thumb is that if you're not up and back down below the tree line by noon, then you are at risk of being struck by lightning. So we made the decision to hike the whole thing in one day by starting at 11 p.m. the night before. So we had rolled up to the trailhead at 10:30, only to find the parking lot completely empty, which felt very odd for a 14er trailhead on a Friday night in late summer. I had done nighttime hikes of other mountains, but the parking lot was usually at least half full at all times, especially in the late summer in Colorado. That made me feel a little uneasy, but I shrugged it off and we started the hike. We started off at a pretty good pace, getting about 5 miles in within the first few hours, and it was about 1 a.m. at this point. We're walking along a narrow part of the trail that has a large rock cropping out to the right of us. As we pass it, we hear a scraping noise followed by some rustling of bushes and then silence. That freaked me out a bit, but I told myself it was a deer, and that we must have spooked him, and we continued along. For the next few miles, I kept hearing little noises off in the distance to our right. About an hour later at 2 a.m., we had just passed Bar Camp, which is about 7 miles from the trailhead, still without seeing any other human being other than my friend. Even the campsite was deserted. Anyway, I'm walking along the trail about 2 to 3 meters ahead of my friend, when I look up a little and see 2 glowing white circles floating in the darkness on the trail about 15 meters ahead of me. My heart sunk, and I stopped dead in my tracks. My friend asked me why I had stopped, and I told him to point his headlamp, which was brighter than mine, up the trail. We saw that the 2 glowing orbs belonged to a mountain lion. At this point I was just frozen, looking at him thinking, crap, that is the last thing I want to see out here. He was quite aware of our presence as well, and stared at us for about 15 seconds, and then retreated into the darkness behind some trees. At this point, without saying a word, I take out a thing of bear mace and hand it to my friend, and we turn around on the spot and begin hiking back down the mountain at a very brisk pace. I was looking right down the trail, and my friend spent about 80% of the time walking back to back with me, so that it wouldn't jump scare us. We made it back down the trailhead at about 3:30, counted our blessings and went home. Overall, the hike was a very unsettling experience. Being deep in the forest, without coming across any other people, especially when you would expect to meet others, is uncomfortable. Let alone being stalked by one of the most dangerous predators in North America. I know that most of the time mountain lions don't attack humans, but I've been told that if you see a mountain lion, then they've been aware of your presence for a good while prior to that, and if they make their presence known to you, it's usually a warning. So I can only assume that all noises I heard that night were from the mountain lion stalking us. Also, the next day we found out why we were alone on the trail. Earlier that day, an elderly man had had a heart attack and died on the trail, so the trail was closed, but we missed the memo since we got up there so late. I used to work security, and several years ago, I was assigned to a remote construction site where a summer camp was being built. It was quite literally in the middle of the woods, roughly 4 or 5 miles into the forest, with only a single access road they'd been using to haul equipment and supplies and such. My job was to provide overnight security doing a foot patrol of the entire area. The patrol covered 2 miles in all, roughly once every hour, and then go back to my post, a tiny wooden shack, not much bigger than a phone booth, to fill out my logs. Other than the occasional black bear and coyotes, it was a very boring assignment, with one exception. I was doing a routine patrol one night near the end of my shift at around 3 a.m. or so. I just passed the gate where the access road enters the site, when I heard an extremely loud and piercing scream that seemed to have come from some distance down the road. It sounded like a woman screaming in absolute terror, so I immediately took off, sprinting as fast as I could in that direction. I didn't hear anything else after the initial scream, but about 1/4 mile or so down the road, I came upon a car parked off just the side. There was no car in sight when I'd come through my way to make my shift, so it must have parked there fairly recently. It wasn't running, no lights were turned on, nor were any doors open. I called out to see if anyone was there to receive no answer, and looked around the general area, but didn't see a thing. Needless to say, I was pretty goddamn sketched out at this point. I ran back to my post and reported what I'd seen and heard to the police, since there really wasn't anything else I could do. Unfortunately, nothing ever really came of it. I never found out whose scream I heard or what caused it. The car was apparently owned by a guy who lived in the area, but I never heard why he was there. My supervisor suggested that maybe I'd heard a mountain lion or other animals screaming, but I've heard these sounds before, and although they're freaky, there's no mistaking an honest-to-goodness human scream. I was in the mountains of North Carolina for several days. It was beautiful and peaceful hiking with my brother and sister and their friend Caleb. Until one early morning at around 3 a.m, when every creature in a 10-mile radius was chirping, squeaking, howling, or scampering through the woods. Being from the Midwest and having survived 2 tornadoes, I thought the worst weather event of my life was about to occur, and there I was sleeping in a hammock. For those of you who don't know, just before a tornado is formed above your head, every animal in sight will be out of there. They know. They can feel it. You can feel it too. You just won't know what you're feeling until the 60-year-old tree beside you is being ripped from the ground. Being in the eye of the tornado is even more strange, as all those same animals are frozen. Sure, they still exist, but their little soul is on hold, and they don't do much more than just look around quietly. It's quite creepy. Anyway, this wasn't a tornado. 3 a.m, the fire we made was just embers, and a roaring thunder of animals freaking out. I peek my head out of the hammock, imagining getting my face smashed in by the first softball-sized hail. With my luck, just for looking. But no, there was no bad weather. There was no storm or looming catastrophe. It was a beautiful night, aside from the roaring animal kingdom. My brother peeked his head out of the hammock above me and looked down to see if I was awake. When he saw my eyes as wide as saucers, he whispered, "What the hell's happening?" I replied, "I dunno, but I wish I was up there in your hammock." Being on the ground level usually is best for guys my size, around 235 pounds. I lack the grace to climb up hammock ropes and jump into bed 8 feet off the ground. The terrifying, creepy roaring continued for about 30 seconds, and then it suddenly stopped. It seemed to be a sweeping effect. There was the outside of the radius, and it stopped first, and the creatures closer to us stopped last, but it was only a second or two difference. It was pretty damn synchronized. My brother and I freaked out. After 5 minutes of silence, we got out of the hammocks and started the fire again. This time we made sure it was big enough to light up 100 feet out. The last thing we need is a Bigfoot or some weird stuff going down. My brother went to check up the ridge on my sister and Caleb, about 60 feet uphill from our hammocks. Caleb always wanted to be at the highest possible safe spot so he could watch the sunrise from his hammock. As soon as my brother got their hammocks, he yelled a shrieking kind of yell for me, the kind I had only heard twice before, when his friend got his bike handle lodged in his stomach about an inch deep, and when he split his own head open. I ran up the ridge with an axe in my hand, with first aid on my left, and flashlight in my teeth, expecting the worst. When I arrived to Caleb's bottom bunk, he was in a state of shock, eyes wide open, shivering and shaking, as he was staring down the valley. Wouldn't you know, my sister didn't even wake up. She had her headphones in all night listening to folk music. Apparently she hates the sounds of animals and preferred to have a controlled mental state. We woke her up and she had no idea what was going on. We eventually got Caleb down to the fire and wrapped him in some blankets. I gave him a shot of whiskey to sip on, but he mostly just held it and stared into the fire. The whole night was too weird for sleep. But then Caleb finally laid down next to the fire and fell asleep at around 5 a.m. The sun came up, and my siblings and I decided to leave the fire and go see the sunrise from the ridge. We all sat in Caleb's hammock, still bewildered. The sun was perfect, and Caleb picked out the best spot you could imagine. But then my brother spotted something strange. "What's that?" he said, pointing down the valley. Right there on the bank of the river. My sister and I were struggling to get his perspective, but then finally noticed a clearing. We decided to go check it out, but one of us had to stay with Caleb, and my sister volunteered, as she hates creepy things. She didn't want us to go down, but we insisted. I left her my axe and emergency GPS signal device, and told her to just scream if she needs us, and to not hesitate to use her pepper spray. So my brother and I hiked down to the river. It took about 20 minutes, but when we arrived we felt very uncomfortable. There were no animals around, no birds, no squirrels, nothing. The clearing on the riverbank was around 100 yards upstream. We took to the higher side of the bank to keep our distance. I don't think either of us actually expected anything to go down, but we wanted to remain cautious. When we were around 50 yards away, at a slight elevation to the clearing, we pulled out our phones to take pictures, but our phones were dead. Mine is known to die, but I have an external battery pack that attaches to my OtterBox that I know was fully charged. My brother's phone was always reliable, and usually he had his portable solar charger attached. But that was dead too. Both of us tried to hold our power buttons to no avail. It was about 100 feet across the clearing, and in the shape of a triangle. All of the bushes and plants that typically grew alongside the river were flattened down. Even some mature azalea bushes that typically stand at 6 to 8 feet tall were eerily lying flat. It's as if something in a triangle shape had bent down as close to the ground as it could get. But nothing appeared broken, but rather as if it had grown along the earth instead of growing up towards the sun. When we got back to camp, Caleb was awake. My sister had a weird look on her face. Caleb was totally normal. "Hey bro, you alright?" my brother asked. "Yeah man, doing fine. Missed the sunrise I guess, I needed the sleep." We looked at him concerned. He was eating a breakfast bar and heating up coffee. We sat down across from him and I asked, "So, do you remember that stuff from last night?" He looked puzzled. My brother added, "You know, when all the animals freaked out and we found you." He looked so confused. My sister said, "Caleb, stop playing." But he asked what we were talking about. My brother said that he was so messed up last night and Caleb laughed and responded, "Yeah, I figured I had to be, because I'd never slept next to the fire or wrapped up in blankets, not after getting that bug in my ear that one time." We continued to probe him, but he had no memory whatsoever. As far as he was concerned, he had too many drinks and slept next to the fire. We told him our story and each of us agreed, but he had no recollection. We told him about the spot next to the river and how our phones wouldn't turn on. We pulled our phones out to show him, and they were already on. My brother had 67% and I had 41%. That gave us the creeps real quick. We decided to pack up camp and get the hell away from that spot. But before we did a final sweep, Caleb asked if we'd seen his camera. He had a nice DSLR Sony with a very good lens, but it was gone. The weirdest part is that he slept with it in his hammock every single time he went camping, and we'd never seen it not on his body. He even had specifically remembered taking it to bed and tucking it in his bag and putting the lens in its special sleeve. It's like a ritual for him. He takes very good care of his stuff. We searched around the ridge, all around the fire and in between the two spots. It was nowhere to be found. Caleb even went down the ridge a bit towards the river in case it had fallen out and rolled down the hill, but it was gone. We had to leave, and my siblings and I agreed to pitch in to buy him a new one if he would just get out of there. About 3 miles and an hour later, my brother turned to me on the trail and said, "Do you think he tried to take a picture of something he wasn't supposed to see?" And the creepiest feeling swept over me and I replied, "Bro, let's just forget how messed up that was and get the hell away from here." And he nodded in agreement. It's been a few years now, and they haven't seen or heard from Caleb in at least 8 months. No one has. I was hiking through the remnants of a remote, long-abandoned town and the surrounding area. To get to as far into the woods as I was, you had to cross fallen trees over a creek 3 times. I had just crossed the 3rd bridge and was about 5 miles in when something blue caught my eye ahead of me. There was a man in his 60s at least, wearing blue satin pajamas sitting in a tree. The closer I got to him, the louder he laughed. It wasn't maniacal, but it set off all the alarms in my head nevertheless. He also wasn't wearing any shoes and looked very well groomed and cleaned. I gave him a friendly nod, and he just kept laughing. Then it stopped. I turned around and he was gone. There was no branch cracking, plants rustling, nothing. He was just gone. It still rubs me the wrong way. The area I was in was pretty rough to hike, very secluded. Not very many people would venture as deep as I did that day, and I seriously wonder what was going on. This story takes place about 4 years ago. It was my wife, my dog, and myself. We were on the second day of an 80-kilometer hike in northern Ontario. We set up camp on a point 750 meters into a lake, one way onto the point and one way off the point. We were hearing wolves since about 9 p.m., went to bed by 10, and the howls were getting closer and closer. Then, one howled from right behind us on the trail down to the point. I got out of the tent and started making loads of noise in an attempt to scare it off. This usually works for bears, whom we've had loads of encounters with. I didn't see anything there, and didn't hear anything either. I went back to bed and laid down, trying to act confident as to not upset my wife. That's when we both heard something outside of the tent. My dog was crazy quiet but shaking. I opened the tent to find a wolf staring at me from about 15 feet away. I grabbed the bear spray and took aim. I didn't use it, but I again started screaming at the wolf and took a few charges towards it. Again, this usually works when faced with a black bear if you have no escape. The wolf didn't really care that I was yelling at it. It kind of hung out for a few seconds, then kind of very casually walked into the tree line, just far enough that I couldn't see it anymore. I built a fire between the tent and the bush, and sat up all night, kept my headlamp on all night, and had to listen to 3 or 4 wolves howl to each other all night about every 20 minutes. They were very close. I would estimate them to be within 50 yards. I'm sure they were here to come and grab my dog. And at about 6 a.m., a bunch of them started howling together, way more than during the night. We waited until about 8 a.m., packed all our stuff and got out of there. We were 36 kilometers, and it took us 2 days to hike in. We hiked out in 6.5 hours. About 1.5 hours into our hike, the wolves started howling behind us again. They were following us. On the hike out, we saw a bear with 2 cubs. This would usually concern us a bit, but we just wanted to get the hell out of there. My wife lost all her toenails from the hike, and my poor dog got some serious anxiety about being in a tent. I am a hunter/mountaineer. It was a chilly December morning. I hiked in pre-dawn, talking about an hour and a half to go 3 miles off the beaten trails. I got to my nest about a half hour before sunrise and began to settle in. The wind kicked up, and a fog rolled in that was thicker than milk. Within a few minutes, my visibility was 5 inches. I'm sitting tight, huddled up against the freezing wind when I start to hear twigs snapping near me. For no apparent reason. What is normally a rapturous sound, indicative of an immediate successful hunt, sent a frosty chill down my spine. I chambered around into my lever action 30-30 as quietly as I could, and lay flat on my back tucked against a fallen tree. The rustling was moving closer through the fog, but I couldn't see anything. The sun was starting to peek over the mountains to my east, and visibility was starting to increase. The rustling of twigs and leaves was sporadic, sometimes directly in front of me, sometimes behind or beside me. I remember laying there, rifle across my chest, thinking to myself how silly it was to react like such a coward. I rationed with myself that bears and mountain lions are a rarity where I was, and I had likely stumbled into a herd of whitetail that had bedded down. So I decided to sit up and the rustling stopped immediately. As it was fully dawn by now, I was looking through the fog for the outline of my prey, which I had assured myself was literally all around me. It wasn't. Seemingly nothing was. By now the fog had faded away, and it was apparent to me that I was alone in those woods. I hunted all day, without seeing as much as a squirrel. Around 3 afternoon, after fighting the wind, and an abnormally cold day, and not wanting to hike out by flashlight, I decided it was time to start back to the truck. Walking out of those woods was the most uneasy I have ever felt. Lawfully, once you make it back to the trail, you're supposed to clear the chamber of your rifle. Not that day. What is normally a stroll through the woods, I undertook with the seriousness of an animal being stalked. I would walk, then stop, then listen, and never heard or saw anything during my retreat, but I could always feel the eyes on me. I was about 100 feet away from my truck when I rounded the last corner, and I saw, hanging at eye level from a tree by a noose, a stuffed bear in a blaze orange jacket. I'm a giant, broad-shouldered outdoorsman, but that one shook me something fierce. The following happened in the lower mainland area of British Columbia. The area is pretty densely forested, with the exception of some walking trails. They're fairly popular, but not popular enough that someone else would be there at the same time as you. There's no cell phone service either. Anyway, an old boyfriend and I were the only ones there this day, and we had made it probably 5 minutes down the trail when we heard this obnoxiously loud, echoing, mechanical noise in the distance. It's usually very quiet out there with the exception of the birds and the wind, so we stopped immediately to listen. It got louder and closer, really fast. It's so difficult to describe what the noise was like. Extremely loud, loud like a loudspeaker. It sounded like it was trying to mimic the sound of a bird squawking or some Jurassic Park dinosaur, but it was too robotic and mechanical sounding to be anything living. Then, this glowing red thing shot out of the top of the trees, and by this time the sound was deafening. The color reminded me of a glowing red stoplight. It was about the size of a hand, but kind of triangle-shaped. No wings or any other markings or feature. It was darting back and forth from the treetops, landing on the branch tips, then flying across to the other trees, with such speed and precision that I couldn't keep my eyes off it. Then it started dive-bombing my face, coming so close it almost hit me, then flying back up to the top of the trees. Before long, there were more of them. They started getting closer, nearly touching me. My hair was literally being whipped around by how fast they were. My boyfriend had to run back down the trail and had apparently been screaming at me to run the entire time, but I hadn't noticed. After about 30 seconds of the attack, they all flew straight up into the sky and away into the trees. I could hear them in the distance for a bit. Then they were gone. We waited there for hours, phones out, ready to record for their return, but they never did. I've returned a handful of times then, waiting in the same spot, but they've never come back. Does anyone have any idea on what this could have been? This happened around November of 2019, and a few friends and I were playing online and chatting over Discord, which we did on a regular basis. We only knew each other by our call signs then, so the people involved were myself, Whisk, and Zed. For those of you who may not know, Discord is an app that you can have on your phone or computer that lets you talk to people, kind of like a group call. We used to talk when we played video games and such, but anyway, we were playing some games and chatting at around 9 PM when Whisk suddenly mentions a noise at his window. He lives in the mountains of North Carolina, far away from any cities on his family land, so having something knocking at his window late at night, while not entirely disconcerting, was a bit strange. He dismisses it and mentions that it's probably just a bird. Then right as he does that, there's a loud crash and a roar. Zet and I are confused for a moment, and we hear some shuffling over the call. Whisk returns back to the phone and says he's all right, but he thinks an animal, perhaps a bear, just busted through his window, and he booked it to his bathroom and locked the door. He is sitting in the bathroom, talking to us on his laptop mic, or he plans to wait it out. We're hearing the roars and banging sounds through the call, and Whisk is trying to keep a cool head, but it's tense, and I try to distract him to keep him calm. We continue talking about things for a few hours, until about 11 p.m, and that is when things start getting strange. Whisk can hear voices from the other side of the bathroom door. Zet and I can hear them too, but we can't make out what they're saying. Then, finally, we hear something clear along the lines of, "Come on out, you big baby," or some other taunt, in the voice of Whisk's cousin. I know what her voice sounds like. I've heard her on calls before, but she lives in a different house, and would have no reason to be there at 11 o'clock at night. There are a few other voices, and Whisk is really getting scared. I do my best to keep him calm, but my own heart is racing at this point. The voices keep shifting between the monstrous sounds of roars and the heavy thuds on the wall until midnight. Zet and I both now start hearing a deep, gravelly voice with a strange echo talking to Whisk through the door of his bathroom. It says something along the lines of, "Don't mock me," as well as, "I can't wait to taste your skin." It was talking over and over, and I was trying to talk over it, keeping Whisk focused on me. Zet and I are both asking for his address, phone number, or anything so that we can call the police and get help. But he's scared out of his mind. This goes on for another hour or so until around 11. I didn't know what else to do, so I pick up my Bible and start reading out loud. Whisk sits and listens, and the strange voice on the other end of the call goes quiet. I read the Bible aloud until about 5 a.m, and I ask Whisk if he's all right. He says he is. Meanwhile, Zet stays quiet. Whisk informs me there's a car in the driveway, which he can see through a small fogged window in his bathroom. He flashes a light to the driver, his uncle, who always carries a hunting rifle in his vehicle. The thing is, whatever it was had gone quiet, and a few moments later we heard the sound of gunshots over the call. Whisk says he's okay, and says goodbye. We head off to bed, and I sleep like a brick, exhausted. I later learned from Whisk that he peeked under the door during the call and looked at what was in the house. He couldn't see much of it, but it sounded terrifying. Long arms, flesh, and skin hanging off the bone almost. A truly horrific sight. It trashed part of his house. We talk about it now and again, and Whisk still refuses to go into the woods or stay home alone. Honestly, I don't know what to make of this. I personally believe Whisk had a close call with something extremely dangerous, and I'm glad that there was some comfort when we stayed with him, even though we couldn't have been much help. The three of us have since become a lot closer, and we're always cautious of the things that live in the woods. Hey guys, it's Mort here. Thank you so much for listening. I did hope that you enjoyed tonight's stories. If you enjoyed tonight's content, I do post 3 or 4 times a week, and it's all story-based content if you enjoy listening. So if you did, that's great. Feel free to subscribe, press the bell icon, all the good stuff. If you heard a few weird baby noises in today's video, it's because I have Leonora in the, I don't know what it's called, like the baby Bjorn. It's like the baby carrier that attaches the baby to your body. So she's here asleep on my chest as I record. Don't worry, she's comfortable. But she did make some weird breathing noises while I was recording, and even though I tried to edit out most of them, if you heard it, well, now you know what it is. But I do hope that you enjoyed the stories for tonight. I certainly enjoyed recording them. It's always fun to do Deep Woods, and yeah, some really mysterious stuff going on there. Be sure to let me your thoughts down below on what you thought they were. Why the hell was that desk out in the middle of nowhere? What threw those boulders? All the strange things that happened within the video. I'd love to hear what you guys think. Huge thanks as always to my members, patrons, and coffee supporters whose names can be seen on screen. If you would like your name at the end and maybe some perks for supporting me in any of these platforms, you can find the link to all of it in the description. But I think I'm going to leave things here for now, guys. Thank you so much for all your support. Hopefully see you on Saturday for a huge video. But for now, stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.